All right, we will go ahead and get started for today. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Beyond Authentication When Secure Access Demands Identity Assurance. This is our mostly monthly webinar focused on all things identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2. I'm Jody Tracy, Program Manager for Cohorts and Accelerators at the InCommon Academy, and I'll be your host for today. To get us started, just a brief overview of today's agenda. We'll do some introductions, we'll hear from our presenters, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions, and then we'll just have a few closing remarks. So just a few reminders about today's program. As always, we'll be taking questions and comments live using the Zoom Q&A function. So please send us your questions during the presentation. We'll answer some questions throughout, but mostly hold questions after the presentation. And then we also encourage you to continue to post messages in the chat. Your comments are here for group discussion. Just be sure when you're posting, your message is being sent to everyone from the dropdown. And finally, just a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you registered for this IAM online, you'll receive an email with the link to the recording as well as the slides. And these materials will also be posted to the InCommon website and the IAM online YouTube channel. So watch your inbox for those links. All right, and now we are excited to begin today's webinar, Beyond Authentication When Secure Access Demands Identity Assurance, and to hear from Kyle Lewis and Tom Barton, and to share our new implementation guidance that helps organizations support identity assurance profile high level of identity proofing defined in the REFEDS Assurance Framework. And in addition to providing this resource, InCommon is conducting a survey to understand what you really need when it comes to higher level identity assurance. So later today, you'll also learn how your input will help us build better support and resources for organizations like yours. And now I'm excited to go ahead and turn things over to Tom.
And Kyle, go ahead and put it on the first screen whenever you're ready.
I'm clicking through the clicker things. There we go.
And the next slide, please. There we go. Hi, folks. I'm Tom Barton. Retired a few years ago from the University of Chicago, still hanging out a bit with InCommon friends and doing some work there. We're here today because we've been hearing about concerns on various campuses about ghost students, financial aid fraud, sometimes about fraud perpetrated on a help desk, an IT help desk in the process of account recovery, and maybe some other kinds of situations or use cases in which fraud is becoming more of an elevated concern. Kind of like MFA became an elevated concern back in the day when there were lots of attacks on our employee self-service functions and people's payroll were redirected to bad guy accounts. Similarly, criminal enterprises have built up around fraud to exploit financial aid in that way. And in response to that, the Department of Education has changed some of their rules and processes around financial aid applications. And in particular, they've added for a certain class of applicants identity confirmation requirements beyond what's been required of submitting along with their application some photocopies of identity documents. This requires live confirmation by an authorized institution official, either in person or over a video, to compare them, to verify that they look like their ID, basically their photo ID. And also the National Institutes of Health are in the process of implementing new identity assurance level requirements for their controlled access data repositories. So those are things that are, it's sort of in the air. Next slide, please, Kyle. So I would imagine we all want to know, and I want to know, how common are these use cases? Are they widespread, or it's just a few places? Where they occur, how does one defend about fraud? And do InCommon or Internet 2 have anything that might help folks to deal with this issue? Next, please. So this is a poll. I think is there a poll coming up? Where were the polls? The poll There we go. Thank you. So here, if you would please, take a moment to check some boxes. Where do you or will you verify identities? Or if you don't know if you're verifying identities, where, if you know, are there elevated concerns about fraud around your campus? So go ahead and check all the boxes that maybe apply. If it's other, don't worry about explaining what kind of other, just check the other box. And I'll give just a moment for folks to check. I can't really see the progress, so I'll just have to kind of guess. You're busy checking away. I will say that Jody mentioned we're going to be sending out an identity verification survey. There's going to be a QR code in a slide at the end of the slide deck today, and it's going to be in people's email boxes tomorrow. So look for that. Oh, this is interesting. Lots of concerns. This is a quite interesting chart for me. So I'm busy digesting this information, but I'll try to wait for the actual survey. But this is a preview of some of the stuff of the kinds of questions that are going to be in that survey. So when you get that link, please do help us out by responding to it. You can have multiple responses per institution. None of that matters. Okay. So identity proofing, I've been talking about it, or vetting, or verification, or assurance, or there's a lot of synonyms used for these terms. I'm just going to go with lay speak here. I mean, I'm not worried about which one. They're all equivalent for our purposes today. It's a process that's designed to reduce the chance that an imposter is accepted as being someone else. How much of a reduction will have to do with the level of identity proofing. There tends to be levels, and just noting that imposters these days can take different forms, actual people or synthetic representations. Next slide, please, Kyle. So there's another poll we're going to put up right now, Jody, if you would. I think I may have said already InCommon or InCommon Federation. I don't know, but I should check to see if folks actually know what that means. And so if you would please really quickly just tell us if you know how familiar are you with the InCommon Federation. And so pick one of those buttons and press it. Oh, so there's one that never heard of us and one that doesn't know about InCommon, well, two, I guess. For a moment, I'll tell you guys really quickly that at a very high level, what the InCommon Federation, not what it is, but what it does for you. If you're a member, it means that there's ways, I won't go into how, that your campus credential can be used to access services far afield, far outside of those operated by the campus or any of your enterprise partners. Institutions, various kinds of research and education, providers of service around the US and around the world can all be accessed with your campus credential, provided, of course, that people are permitted access by whatever their access control policy is, like they have the right kind of privileges. Thanks. You can close that out now for us, Jody. And Kyle, you can go to the next slide. So InCommon is this federation. We are the US piece of an international, more than 70 countries that do much to participate in an equal way to, enable research and education to happen at global scale. And we want it always to happen and happen interoperably, but we also want to be able to handle higher value transactions when there's greater risk involved with that campus authentication to some kind of a repository. We want InCommon members to be able to address those where that makes sense for them. And with regard to assurance and identity assurance, we've been involved with federal partners since they began articulating these concepts about 20 years ago. We've been involved with them ever since, all along. And one of the reasons that we think that we're here today with this topic is that one of the things InCommon does is it helps convene U.S. higher eds to discuss, and common problems that they share, and also for oftentimes means to help them address those problems. Next slide, please, Kyle. So I've been saying Kyle this, Kyle that. He's, you should know, he's a good guy. He's retired from the Air Force, where he was cyber ops. And that experience has been incredibly relevant and useful in the R&E community that he's gone to since retiring, or about 4 or 5 years ago, whatever. He's been a contributor to InCommon and REFEDS on their security and assurance efforts of various sorts. He led the working group that created the REFEDS Assurance Framework version 2.0 that's going to figure in his talk today. He's also the co-author of the REFEDS Assurance Framework 2 implementation guidance for U.S. higher eds, and also a co-author of another doc for federal officials like he used to be to help them decide if the IAP high level of assurance, identity proofing assurance from REFEDS Assurance Framework, is close enough to the National Institute of Standards and Technology's own Identity Assurance Level 2. So Kyle, would you please take it away and inform us all about how they can implement guidance that might help them address some of these use cases?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the very kind introduction. So I'm going to get a little existential for a moment, and we talk about why are we here, and why are we talking about the REFEDS Assurance Framework? Why do we care about signaling assurance? And Tom has already hit upon a lot of the important ideas of identity assurance and protecting against the risk of identity fraud and someone claiming who they are not. And in this case, we are focusing on, are you sure the person is who they claim to be when you issue them their account in the first place? It's not necessarily about authentication assurance, multi-factor authentication. Those go hand in hand, but that's not the part of the machine that we're focusing on today. The other thing Tom alluded to is the federal component of like NIH looking at accepting the REFEDS Assurance Framework. And so just to set the stage, we have this community of higher education and some government participation, part of an international community. We have a whole bunch of services available. Maybe it's a university sharing out a service, or a library service to other university members. Maybe it's the NIH having some of your users, some of your scientists at your universities coming in and participating in research and accessing the government system. We have these service providers here, and they're hosting service or data that might be sensitive. And on the government side, they have requirements for security accreditation. And so there's been this evolving conversation over the past several years of, well, what happens when the government starts enforcing some of the services that are offered to the Federation? And Tom has alluded to the NIST governance and all that's in play. And I got involved with this of, how do we translate what we do in this community to the government requirement? And so what's recently happened, before I get into the details of the slide, is certain sensitive research services that are available in the InCommon Federation to users who need access to it are going to start enforcing what they call Identity Assurance Level 2, IAL2. That's the NIST. That's the U.S. federal bits and nuts and bolts of how they guarantee identity assurance. And they're going to start enforcing that by making users either go to login.gov or ID.me or a third party, or, and this is the big breakthrough for us, if your university is an identity provider in the InCommon Federation, and you use InCommon's adopted standard for communicating identity assurance, the REFEDS Assurance Framework, they will accept that as reasonably equivalent to the NIST requirement. And that's kind of a huge development that we've been working on, having that conversation for the past 5 years. So the thing that began that conversation, though, is we as a community realized REFEDS Assurance Framework needed to be updated. That update was published in 2023. And then shortly thereafter, the Risk Acceptance Guide for Service Providers, actually Tom and I co-wrote that together with an intended audience for U.S. federal service providers, but it really is useful for any InCommon service provider as a way to look at, if you're looking at this versus NIST, what are the real risk gaps? What are the things you can't be sure is covered, and where might you want to come up with some compensating controls? So we'll have a link to that later on in this session. So if you represent any service provider, whether it's government or not, you might find this interesting to read. But then the recent one that came out that we had a working group for was how do identity providers actually do the thing? We have this framework that's kind of ephemeral. This topic is not easy. People who have been in this field for years argue all the time about what it means. So we built kind of a helping guide. And so the REFEDS Assurance Framework is important because it's, like I said, it's InCommon's adopted standard, though it hasn't been formally published as such yet, but there's a working group looking at baseline expectations beyond, or expectations beyond baseline for InCommon members. So one of the expectations are if you're going to be interoperable and you're a service provider that needs assurance, the InCommon recommended thing is the REFEDS Assurance Framework. And it allows you to basically signal that assurance to each other in an international context as well. The final question, there might be someone out here that's lucky enough that says, hey, I've already implemented all this. I've already implemented NIST IAL2, or I have a Kantara service that's certified to this. Why do I even need this? Well, that's great. If you've implemented that level of identity assurance, almost none of the rest of this presentation matters to you because you already more than qualify for all the REFEDS claims. But I would argue you still want to make those claims because the NIST framework does not give you a way to actually tell the external service provider how sure you were of that person's identity. It's a way to signal assurance. Remember, in the Federation where identity providers in one institution, service providers might be halfway across the world, this is a way to tell them. Getting into the equivalencies, I'd like to say we have 3.5 columns here. The right column is in text, but we're looking at if you have REFEDS Assurance Framework high, what does that kind of map to in these other frameworks? And in this slide, we're looking at the US framework. So we have the current NIST 63.3-3 that's been around for 5-ish plus years, and then the 63-4 that was released officially last month, and it changes the paradigm a little. But the risk gap is going to be the same. And so the Venn diagram basically shows high covers almost all the box of IAL2, but not all. And that's what that service provider document thing is that I alluded to. And then everyone in the US is going to have at least institutionally some familiarization with the I-9 and the E-Verify process because those are required for all US employers to go through. And so we're going to talk in here, and we talk in the document about how you have some existing business processes that could be leveraged to make some of these equivalent claims. And so I'm not going to read the column on the right because I'm going to hit that again multiple times later in this presentation as we go through high, medium, and low. So we have this document now. It's about 2 months old or 2 months new. And again, we'll include the link for this at the end. It is not a technical implementation document. It's not going to tell you actually how to do SAML code or make OIDC, the federated assertions. We assume you know how to do that, or someone on your team knows how to do that. What this document does is help you determine and understand, if I do this thing already, what claim am I allowed to make under the REFEDS Assurance Framework? A lot of the feedback that I've heard in the past 5 years at various forums and conferences is kind of a fear and uncertainty about, I don't know if I can make any claims. This is pretty complicated, or I don't know that we're doing the thing. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do is parse through that and help you figure out what you qualify for. These are some of the key ideas that if you're an identity provider that the document is built upon. If you are an InCommon member and living up to baseline expectations, which we assume you are, there are already claims that you qualify for, and you have to do zero work other than go in and to your SAML code or your OIDC configuration and make that claim. The other thing is people fear like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. Yes, but you don't have to eat the whole elephant. Not ever. You use it to the claims to articulate what you're already doing as a minimum, and you may not ever need to do more than that. And you don't have to do it for your whole user population. You only have to do it for those users that might be accessing service providers that want those levels of assurance. So maybe you have a scientific community that uses one of these NIH systems, and you have a lot of them, and they want to be able to continue to log in with their own institutional credentials. You might have to look at how do you get to IAP high and make that claim for them. So, and we'll talk about how some of your users already qualify their claims today. And you probably have some existing processes, not probably. I guarantee you have something out there that can be leveraged to achieve some of the framework already. The other two approaches that we took, we did not organize our implementation guide in the same order that the topics are talked about in the framework. We basically phased it to do the easy stuff first. So we try to bring you into the implementation at a least level of effort to, we'll worry about the hard stuff later. And by the time you get there, you'll determine maybe this wasn't so hard after all, or you'll have a better idea. And then the other idea here is the assurance framework itself is written from an international perspective by design. So it's a little broad in how it puts together some ideas, like how you verify and validate that someone is a user based on evidence. And while here in the US, we don't have a national registry that, like some of the other countries in the EU might, that they can just, it's an easy problem for them because it's nationally implemented. We tend to use driver's licenses or other forms of ID cards. And so we've written this decoding of the framework from a US-centric cultural approach. Probably what the most common cases that most of you all will see. So again, to focus, some of your users today already qualify for these claims, and you have existing business processes that you can leverage. Now, today, we're not going to go through the whole document. There's going to be a longer talk at TechX that we go into more detail on the other parts, but we want to focus on identity assurance claims or identity proofing those claims, because that's kind of the big deal, I would say, when NIH is now saying, hey, we will accept an IDP from an InCommon making a RAF IAP high claim. So what does that even mean, IAP high? Well, the identity assurance profiles, these claims, are broken up into philosophically two different approaches in the framework. One's risk-based, which is the local enterprise claim, and one is process-based, which breaks down into the more familiar low, medium, and high. It's easier to get your head around that. So we'll talk about the weird one first, which is local enterprise. This is basically a claim that's saying, look, I have some users that access my critical information systems. That might be HR people with employee records. It might be financial people with my financial data. But I have some people that have access to really important stuff. And I had to get to a level of trust with those people to give them a network account with that access. I'm not going to necessarily talk about how I came to that level of trust, but I have a way. And then if you have people that have gone through that same kind of process, then they can be given local enterprise. So those people that have that kind of access and anyone else has gone through a similar level of account issuance and identity verification, you trust them to the same level. It does not mean that those people have access to your critical systems. It means they have gone through the same level of verification and validation that you trust identity to the same level that the people who do have access. And what I mean by trust their identity, what I mean is you trust that they are who they claim to be, very specifically. The implementation guide has some examples of what critical systems might be for your institution. This is a descriptive list, an exemplary list. This is not a prescriptive list. This does not tell you that your institution has to say all these are critical to your institution. This is why this risk-based approach is very subjective to you. And then, someone else, a service provider, trusting your users at local enterprise are basically trusting that, you're kind of like them and you want to protect your own interests. So they're going to trust that your local enterprise is going to be good enough. So that being said, based on that definition, if you work at a university, you have critical systems for your university or government or whatever. And you have those people who have access to those systems automatically by definition qualify for local enterprise. And so do any other users that have gone through a similar or better proofing process. So you already have a user population that qualifies. The spec does not require that this process, this risk assessment, this risk determination needs to be formal, but it just has to be there. Okay, so that was kind of the weird case. The government, at least NIH, has said the local enterprise is not what they're looking for necessarily. They're going to be looking for IAP high. So that moves us over to these process-based requirements. And that's more of a where the spec says, okay, if you want to claim low, your process has to do these things. And then medium has some more things. And obviously high has even more. All of them have certain things in common. So when I talk about the differences later on, and I say IAP low, all you have to do is prove you're a person. Plus, you have to have your process documented. If this is how I prove it's a person, and you have that documented in your help desk or whoever follows that process, then you're good. But that has to be there for all of these IAPs, including a record of when the person was proofed. It's usually tied to, Tom will probably correct me, not always, but I'd say conceptually it's tied to when the account was issued, or the process leading up to that, and then what level they were proofed at. And yes. And then obviously the changes to this gets a little bit into the authenticator binding part, but if they change their password, how do you preserve the assurance? And it's not just some random person going up and saying, "Hey, I lost my password." So there's a minimum level of requirements for all of them in there. For low, medium, and high, once we get that part to start talking about the differences, if you were starting out in this and you got to the point where we were saying, now we want to describe what we're already doing with the claims that REF gives us, you need to start looking at your onboarding processes for people coming into your institution that ends up in them getting an account at some point. So that will probably be talking to your HR office, your badging office, registrar. You'll have a number of different entry points, or maybe you're at one of those institutions that's doing it all yourself at the IT help desk because the rest of the university says, we think this is an IT problem, and you've done your best to articulate that it's not, but you know how IT works. So that's always possible. Common terms, claimant, we're just talking about the person seeking the account here, and the registrar is the person of the system doing the proofing that's going to end up being this person can have an account. So in a nutshell, these are the cartoons that show the differences in very broad thumbnail terms of an in-person proofing process. Not getting to the details of what if they're registering online. IAP low, they just have to be a person. We don't care who they are. We don't care that they can call themselves whatever they want. It's self-asserted identity. So basically in the in-person process, someone walks up to your help desk and you can say, oh, yep, you're a real person. You're not a bot, because I can, at least today, I can tell it with my eyes. And you let them into your network and you give them an account at IAP low. IAP medium is just the next level up. You check an ID card. Your registrar has been trained on. I've seen a million New Jersey driver's licenses. I know what one looks like, and I know I have to hold hologram up or do whatever. But it's a visual inspection, and okay, the picture looks like this person. Great, come on in. That's IAP medium. And IAP high takes that one step further. It's not just enough to do the in-person check, but you have to be able to validate it with an external source. If there is a cryptographic feature on that piece of identity evidence, you have to be able to check that cryptographically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, there's a reach out to somewhere else to validate the identity, and that's IAP high in a nutshell. So getting into more detail, IAP low. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, IAP low, relatively easy bar. If anyone that you've hired has gone through the I-9 process or automatically qualify for low. And the only thing that would prevent you from implementing low today is, do you have a documented process? Go look at the general requirements, or do you have a way to protect the password change event for lost passwords? You look at those things, which probably you're already doing, and you should be able to make IAP low claims for anyone who's an employee. That may not apply to students or partners or other users, but it will apply to at least employees. But you should go talk to your admissions office, and here's the idea. It's like, oh, students probably had to submit transcripts to get into the school. They're people. They're real people. You look at that process, and they get to low. For remote proofing, the the requirements don't change. The requirements are still the same. You have to check for personhood. It's you as an IDP now have to sit back and think, okay, how do I check for personhood if I'm not seeing the person? So the requirement doesn't tell you, the spec doesn't tell you how to solve the problem. It tells you what problem needs to be solved. And the common thing here is we've always seen the CAPTCHA things that say, are you a robot or not? So if you do something like that, you can get to IAP low, again, with minimal effort. But the reality is if there's a service provider in the Federation that has made a decision that they're going to deny access based on claims, it's unlikely they're going to be looking for low. They're probably going to be asking for higher. So medium, we get to a person with reasonably validated and verified identity. Well, what does that mean? So again, the spec talks about the added features to your process. And so the basic way you're going to solve it in the US is, did they submit an unexpired government issued photo ID? Someone checked it, it appears valid, it matches the person standing in front of them. For the I-9 processes, what's interesting is depending on how your institution implements it, whether they combine that with E-Verify or not, I-9 by itself does not require a photo ID, even though probably 99% of the people who come to be employed will provide a photo ID to do that part of the process. But there are ways you can get through the I-9 process without a photo ID. That being said, so you can't say, hey, you need to start requiring this for I-9. But doing I think the E-Verify requires a photo ID, or it has a backup in case there's not. And so you just talk to your HR people and see what the process is. And if you determine that anyone being onboarded has to provide the government issued photo ID, they're most likely already IAP medium. Yeah, and then you can confirm. You can also leverage your student or campus or institutional badging office. They probably had a process in place before they issued badges, security badges, student badges, whatever it is. If you understand that process, maybe as on the IT side, all you need to do is check the campus ID, and a lot of that work's already been done for you. So you can get to medium pretty easily there. We like to call that the transitive property, but you should consider those kinds of things. Moving on to medium, and now we have this idea of remote proofing. And we have two kinds of remote proofing: live or, so supervised or unsupervised. So supervised just basically means it's happening in real time. You're on the camera with someone. There are ways to do liveness checks to make sure they're a person, and how do you validate their information. And if it's unsupervised and you're checking the identity evidence that they've scanned in or however they've provided it to you after the fact, then there might be some third-party tools that you need to acquire to check to verify that identity. Because what happens at medium is once you go to unsupervised remote, it starts to bring in some of the high in-person requirements. So to add some rigor to the medium, just to take into the account, you're not looking the person in the eye. And at high, now we're talking about a well-validated and verified identity. The requirements that we saw at medium unsupervised remote now become required at high for in-person proofing and supervised proofing. And the reality is, once you get to this point, you're probably going to have to look at third-party solutions, either vendors or government provided. I know there's a service out there you can use to validate driver's licenses. There's things you can do with e-passports, and there's a number of like the Kantara Initiative Trust Status List, a number of commercially available providers that have solved this, and we'll be happy to sell you their services. But they do solve that, and if the Kantara list gets you higher than RAF, it gets you to NIST IAL2. And because it exceeds the NIST IAL2, you can then go and make all the RAF claims that you want to be able to communicate that trust across the Federation. Because remember, having IAL2 doesn't mean you can actually tell a service provider that at login time. The REFEDS Assurance Framework allows you to do that. So again, getting back to leveraging your campus ID cards. There might already be existing processes that have been solved for you that can get you to high. Um, and then supervised and unsupervised remote proofing. We talked about some of the differences there. Doing the physical security feature check might be difficult depending on what it is. For remote proofing, your decision tree is probably gonna get you to some kind of third-party solution to solve that level. So bottom line, you have existing practices. You might have to do a little sleuthing on your own to go talk to HR, talk to your registrar, your student registrars. But certainly you'll be able to leverage I-9 and E-Verify. Student admissions, they've received transcripts from the students that they've verified. And maybe you already have a fraud mitigation process in place from your help desk because you've had to implement it for other security reasons. Then you can say, hey, I already qualify for a lot of these claims. I can start signaling those. But the key is, whatever validated attributes you have on those people, who they are, their names, their identities, you can link them to the credentials through making the login assertions. So what happens now? You've gone through this process and you've figured out what you're already doing. Again, I like to think of the REFEDS Assurance Framework claims as a language, and I can articulate what I do today, and then I go, okay, well, where do I need to be? Maybe I'm good, but if you have a strong business case, that's when you start looking at stepping up and doing more. And we would argue if you don't need to do more, don't do it. So this is kind of the preview of what we'll get into in the TechX presentation, which looks beyond just the IAP levels, but this is how the document is laid out, and it's from easiest to do to hardest to do, and we just start describing what we do first already, and I highlight those first two blocks, the conformance criteria, which is detailed in the spec, IAP local enterprise. Those are things you can make claims on today. So to bring it all together, implementation of RAF is incremental. You don't have to do it all at once. You already meet some of it. You may have to come up with step-up processes to address gaps for the subset of your users that need it, because remember, you don't have to do this for your entire campus. Maybe you only have 50 users that need access to a certain service. Maybe it's 10. And then focus on leveraging existing practices. And those are the links, and I think this is the cue. Yes, I can see them starting to appear in the chat, so you don't have to hurriedly try to type out long links. Oh no, the trust status list is there. So Jody, if you could, there we go. Perfect. All the links. We give you all the links. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Well, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A as well. And thanks, Carl. That was an event, wasn't it? It's a lot of details, but I think it's just good to repeat what Kyle tried to say a number of times, is that there's probably stuff you're doing in one business office or another corner of the institution that can be leveraged. So you want to go have a discussion with those folks, find out, and there may be the gap of not being able to, for your identity and access management systems to get the signal from HR or financial aid or wherever to know. So there's that, there's always that, but you can look around and see if there's things to build on, or possibly if folks have needs like that, and that's not their business. It's no one's line of business at a university, really to do identity proofing. Maybe HR is a little close to that. They may appreciate someone coming by who has some positive, some constructive suggestions to help them too. So there's a partnership opportunity when you arrive to ask questions and find out what's going on. Anyway, this is the first of the two questions that are out here, and there's still time to add a few more, is how does one verify the genuineness of an ID for a remote person? That's a really good question. And, I guess this is kind of silly in a way. It's machine learning and AI, basically. There are services that have built up over the past few years collecting loads of data about identity documents in the US, bank statements from all kinds of banks, documents issued by various countries, all manner of things. And they've done all kinds of training of AI to detect when things are correct examples of those or if there's been some attempt at jiggering them. Okay, that's part of it, a large part of it. There is also various ways that they can not just look at the genuineness of the ID itself, but they'll have databases of personal information that they'll see. Does there appear to be a person in the world already that has the same name and birth date or address or whatever those identifying attributes are on the ID? And so that's also part of how they check those things. So that marshaling of resources from far and wide is something that no university, it's not in their mission, going to be anywhere close. And so that's why you would buy a commercial service that can do those things for you. I hope that answers your question, Phil. And then Nigel of the Georgia Southern says, what about expiration of assurance? An issue we have is users who were assured when they first enrolled 8 years ago, but then they come back for another degree, potentially with their identity stolen and being impersonated, and they are still trusted after the first check. Well, that's a good question. It comes up sometimes. I can say that in the REFEDS Assurance Framework, there is no requirement to refresh or reproof anybody after any particular period of time. Likewise, with the National Institute of Standards and Technology 863-3 and -4, they also do not have a requirement to recheck identity every now and again. That doesn't mean that some folks are concerned about it, or you might see a reason to. But that's really more for you then. You don't need that. The Department of Ed won't require that. The National Institutes of Health won't require that, so far as we know.
I
Yeah,
would like to add to that because I think there's a piece here that sometimes isn't, or it's implied. I like to think of the assurance as like a chain of custody of assurance. And so you do identity proofing when you issue the account first time, you go through that and here's your credential. But after that, what really preserves the trust long term is the authenticator binding. How good is your authenticator assurance, which again, RAF is kind of a little bit out of scope for RAF, but you kind of got to put them together. So in RAF, we do have this thing of if someone comes and they haven't bound other authenticators to back up who they are in case they lose their password or whatever it means, or they have to get re-identity proofed. So in the situation that you're talking about, where they might have come to the campus, departed, then come back. As an IT guy, I would think about like, well, were they still active with their authenticator? Did they leave long enough to have their account deactivated? Are they still a valid network citizen? And are they still the same authenticating as the same level? We're probably good. But if they're not, then maybe there's probably a business practice that you might need to recommend they need to be reproofed.
yeah. Yeah, and I think we talk about this, the example you cite, Nigel, maybe it's been a while since they've graduated, now they're re-enrolled. And I think as Kyle was saying, chances are, I don't know how things work at Georgia Southern, but chances are that they have not maintained control of their Georgia Southern authentication credential throughout. So you're not, you don't have that basis for continuing to trust that they are the correct, they're the bona fide person. And then Mehdi, I guess that's University of maybe University of Florida, I guess. What identity attribute changes do you think should trigger identity proofing? For example, if a legal name change happens, do you think an identity proofing should be triggered and lowering their IIL to the lowest level until it is successfully complete? Could be. And it's a great question because you're right, Mehdi, that there's two other things apart from the identity. So the initial identity proofing, where you essentially check that they are who they claim to be to some degree. You also, from that, you get not only the binding between a person and an authentication credential, you also have verified some identifying attributes about them, almost always their name, usually a birth date and or an address. Maybe nothing else, but you'll have those things. It'll almost always be a name. It'll be a name as it appears on a government issued ID, so some kind of formal or legal name, whatever you want to call that. And if that name, that legal name, is going to be changed. You want to watch careful the process that changes it. If that's a good enough process that maintains throughout the change, from the old name to the new name, that binding with the person somehow, then you don't need to reprove, but you need to examine that whole process. If that's absent or until that should be present and how that name change process proceeds, you would have to do as you suggest. You would need to temporarily lower their identity proofing level until you could reproof them. And again, make sure that you've got government ID with their new name on it and it looks like them and so forth. I hope that helps. And I see there's some other comments. So Nigel saying at Georgia Southern, adding reproofing to our self-service password reset would be definitely interesting. It makes sense with the way to deal with exploration. And I think, Nigel, too, I think I've heard, at least anecdotally, of at least some campuses that for account recovery at the help desk, new password or recover a second factor or something, some have put some form of unattended remote proofing in the workflow to follow before they'll proceed to actually, recover the account for the caller. Because the help desk personnel with their institutional data, the resources we've traditionally had don't suffice. I mean, fraudsters can easily defeat those kinds or correctly answer those kinds of questions. So they're going to have a much harder time dealing with the remote identity proofing service like on the Kantara trust list. Let's see, the last question here in the chat, when you assert an assurance level with SAML attributes, do you send over multiple attributes? Oh, yes. Great question. So yes, if you have proofed the person to high, you should also send medium and low. If you've proofed them to medium, you should also send low, basically. All the things that are true, because it's possible that some relying party was happy with medium, and you don't want to force them to have logic built into their system that says if I get a high, then that's good enough for medium, that kind of thing. So just kind of keep it easy on the relying party. The date of the proofing should that be included in the assertion? It is not. So first of all, the REFEDS Assurance Framework is the standard that defines those claims and the identity assurance claims, and they do not have a date of issuance. The point is, and kind of relates to what we just talked about whether they ever expire. The point is, if you're asserting it, you've proofed them, and you're satisfied, you don't need to reproof them yet. So the presence of the claim, I think, implies the currency of the claim.
And it is really a statement about a one-time event or snapshots in time if you reproof them. What maintains the assurance is the authenticator strength and other things.
Yes.
So if you have a requirement as a service for IAP high, and you're going to deny access to people if they don't claim IAP high, but you don't require the REFEDS MFA profile, you probably need to rethink, your security custody, so to speak.
And there's a little twist in the REFEDS Assurance Framework version 2. We say as much there, but it's not that is a specified requirement. It's really that documents what the IAP low, medium, and high processes must do, and how much they must do. And we say that, just what Kyle said, you need to have a strong authentication bound to an identity assurance claim to trust the identity assurance claim.
The NIST frameworks are the same because they have the identity and then the authentication assurance level, and they say in the text, if you have a requirement for IAL2, you also have a requirement for AAL2 authentication level.
Yep. I think we have burned through all the questions presented so far. We do have a few minutes left. Tell you what, while folks are thinking, yes?
Did you answer the last question in the
Oh, did I finish? Did I wander off that one? I talked about legal name.
The date of the proofing, including the assertion, is the last one I see.
Am I missing one? Oh, that one. No, I think I just did, Jody. Talked about date of birth, not in the claim, right?
All right.
So while folks are scratching their heads if there's any more questions right now, Kyle, could you go to the next slide? I think it's the next one. Keep going. Keep going. One more. I'll go. Jody, where's the thing with
That's the
the
question.
identity verification survey QR code? Is that in here?
We
That's
were,
I,
yep,
Oh, we were there.
we were
yeah,
on
we
it
were
the
already
whole
there.
time.
My question and answer screen covered. Never mind. Yes, Barton brain failure right there. So there's that QR code, folks. You can go ahead and do your QR code thing. That'll take you to the survey. You'll also, I think attendees are all going to receive an email tomorrow, I think, with some explanation and a link in it as well. So you have more opportunity to try that. You can go ahead and click it right now if you feel like it.
Yeah, and I posted
Any
that in
last
the
words,
chat.
Kyle?
Now, there's one more question that just came in from Colin, and it's talking about automated proofing, vendors, machine learning, trends of zero trust to also impact identity verification. Constant identity proofing. That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer to that.
That seems
It would have to be automated.
that would be,
I think it's going to be difficult in our national framework or national culture for.
I mean, I don't know, Colin, if you had like Minority Report constant identity proofing in mind or what. So there's campus life, interactions with the feds, and general consumer, and there'll probably be different answers or different timeframes for all of those kind of major different contexts. We're not sure yet, and NIST is continues to do research on what synthetic fraudsters, what synthetic approaches can be used to defeat some of the measures that are in place currently. And it's not clear, frankly, that just repeating the same would be any additional mitigation if there is some kind of, malware technology that gets around this stuff. That would just mean we'd have to find, but this is nothing new either. This is always the way it is in security. Attackers, the red team comes up with some new ways around existing defenses, and then blue team defenders figure out how to adjust what they do to detect or respond or prevent those new kinds of attacks. It's the same kind of a thing. About zero trust, by the way, I think that the whole zero trust architecture idea likely gives a little more weight to identity proofing. The point that kind of is, the kind of a shorthand message of that is, don't rely on perimeter network, preventative defenses. You need to have basically all the way to every access to each sensitive resource, that you have a number of things you've figured out by that time about the user to decide whether or not to give them a session at that resource. And so and that's kind of why the NIH is implementing identity assurance requirements for accessing some of their more sensitive data repositories, for that same kind of reason.
There's another question that came in.
How institutions manage the cohorts that are proofed at higher levels? Do you proof a certain cohort? Oh, so that's a good question too. Oh, they're all good questions. So Kyle talked about a number of situations where there may be some group of people that can be high because of existing processes, or maybe you enhance those existing processes a little bit so that you can meet the IIP high. So that's a cohort. But oftentimes it's going to be, or certainly in the early going, it may be what we sometimes call step up. That is, you don't do things categorically yet for any whole cohort. But if someone needs to do it, like they say, hey, I can't get to my controlled access data repository at NIH. Can you guys, give me a step up? That could be a help desk thing, perhaps, where they simply put them through that, they use the automated, unattended, third-party procured commercial service to do that. And then you record the fact that it was done and successfully, presumably, wherever it is in your identity and access management systems, so that the IDP can give the corresponding claim when that person shows up at the NIH. So let me know if I cohort of not more cohort of users. Okay.
So what I'm going to say to that as a practical example is, every institution will have a different answer to that, really. At our lab in Uganda, when we went through this drill, we talked to HR and we determined that everyone hired after a certain date qualified for high, because we understood the process and it was tightly controlled. And everyone who was hired before a certain date did not, because the HR process had changed, and we categorized them all as medium. And then we implemented a step-up procedure for those that might come to us needing more, and not all of them have.
Jody,
right.
I think it's to you to walk us out of here.
Sounds good. Kyle, do you mind just paging to the last slide there? Awesome. Thank you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Tom and Kyle, for this deeper look into the REFEDS Assurance Framework. Thanks to you all for attending, jumping in, asking really great questions.